The night my future mother-in-law handed me her coat and told me to be careful not to wrinkle it, I was standing in the entryway of her own home, wearing the dress I'd bought specifically to meet her for the first time. I didn't say anything. I took the coat, hung it in the closet, and smiled at her back as she walked away toward the living room. My fiancé had no idea what had just happened. He was still parking the car. Let me back up. My name is Maylin. I'm a registered nurse at the hospital in Ottawa, and 3 years ago I met the man I was going to marry at a continuing education seminar on emergency trauma protocols. His name is James. He was there representing his clinic. I was there because my charge nurse had signed me up, and I had no real choice in the matter. And we ended up sitting next to each other for 6 hours, arguing quietly about the correct way to approach a case study involving a hypothetical patient with 3 conflicting diagnoses. By the end of the seminar, I had his number. By the end of the month, I knew I was going to love him for a very long time. James is kind in a way that's hard to describe without sounding like you're writing a greeting card. He remembers small things. The way I take my tea. That I hate phone calls and prefer texts, that I get quiet when I'm overwhelmed rather than loud. He never made me feel like I had to explain myself. Growing up as the daughter of Chinese-Canadian immigrants in a mostly white suburb outside of Kingston, I had spent a lot of my life explaining myself. James was the first person who just paid attention instead. His family was a different story. His mother, I'll call her by what James called her, which was just my mother, delivered always in a slightly flattened tone that I didn't fully understand until much later, had apparently been the subject of gentle warnings from James's aunt and his older sister both. She has strong opinions, his sister told me once, in the careful way people use when they mean something much worse. She loves James very much, his aunt said, which I would eventually understand was code for she loves him so much that she considers anyone he loves a threat. James and I had been together for 14 months before he finally arranged for me to meet her. 14 months. I had asked about it maybe 4 times, and each time there was a reason it wasn't quite the right moment. His mother had been traveling, she'd been unwell. There was a family thing. I stopped asking after the 4th time and waited. Because I trusted James, and because I could feel the shape of the problem without needing it named. When the dinner was finally scheduled, I was genuinely nervous in the way you get nervous about things that matter. I wanted to make a good impression. I picked out my outfit carefully, dark trousers, a jade green blouse my mother had given me, small pearl earrings. I brought a hostess gift, a bottle of Chateau de Champs Cabernet from Niagara that I'd researched specifically because I knew she appreciated Ontario wine. I rehearsed small talk. I was ready. What I was not ready for was her opening the door, looking directly past me at James, saying, "Sweetheart, you look tired, come in," and then turning to me and saying, "You can leave the shoes on the mat and hang your things in the closet on the right." Just like that, as though she didn't know who I was, as though James hadn't told her, or she hadn't processed it, or she had processed it perfectly well and simply chosen not to acknowledge it. James said, "Mom, this is Maylin," and she said, "Yes, of course," in a tone that meant nothing at all, and moved toward the kitchen. I stood in the entryway for a moment. James caught my eye and gave me a look that was half apology, half plea. I squeezed his hand and followed her. The dinner was long. Her house was beautiful in the way that expensive houses in the glebe sometimes are. High ceilings, original hardwood, art that had been deliberately chosen rather than accumulated. She had made a roast, which was genuinely delicious, and she talked throughout the meal about James's childhood, his accomplishments, his late father's family. The history of various properties and investments and expectations that I gathered were part of some larger picture I was supposed to find impressive. She didn't ask me a single question about myself until 40 minutes in when she said, "And what is it you do again, Maylin?" with the "again" implying James had told her and she simply hadn't retained it. "I'm a registered nurse," I said. "Trauma unit at the General?" She said. And then, to James, "Do you remember the Henderson's daughter? She finished her residency at the Civic last spring. Cardiology, brilliant girl." I took a sip of wine. After dinner, while James was helping clear the plates, his mother followed me into the living room and sat down across from me with the posture of someone who had decided it was time to have a frank conversation. She was a handsome woman in her late 60s, white-haired in a precise cut, a wool cardigan that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. She looked at me the way you look at something you're considering returning. "James tells me your family is from Hong Kong," she said. "My parents immigrated from Hong Kong in the late 80s, I said. "I was born here in Kingston." She said again. "And is Tim in Kingston?" "My mother is." "My father passed away 4 years ago." "I see." A pause. "James's father's family has been in this part of Ontario for 4 generations. There are certain expectations that come with that, certain traditions. I just want to make sure you understand what you'd be entering into." I looked at her. "I think I understand families," I said quietly. She smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sure you do." James came back into the room and the conversation folded back into pleasantries, and I sat there smiling and agreeing and asking polite questions about her garden for another hour until we finally said goodnight. In the car on the way back to his place, James said, "I know she can be a lot, she just needs time." I looked out the window at the street lights along the Queensway. "Sure," I said. I spent the drive home deciding not to fight about it that night, but I also spent it understanding, clearly and completely, that his mother had looked at me and seen someone who didn't belong. James proposed 7 months later, on a Saturday in November, at the spot on the Rideau River where we'd gone for a walk on our third date. It was raining lightly and neither of us had an umbrella, and he laughed at himself while he was saying it, which made me cry a little, which made him laugh more. I said yes before he finished the sentence. His mother's response when he called her that evening was, "Well, that's quite a step." Not "congratulations." Not "I'm so happy for you." "That's quite a step." James didn't repeat this to me right away. I found out from his sister, who told me with the expression of someone delivering information they hoped would not destroy anything. I told James I knew. He was quiet for a long time and then he said, "I'm going to handle this." I believed him. Or I wanted to. The engagement period was 6 months of wedding planning, punctuated by a steady trickle of interference that James mostly shielded me from and that I mostly pretended I didn't know about. His mother had opinions about the venue. We chose a restored heritage barn outside of Almonte, Ontario, which he called rustic with audible distaste. She had opinions about the date, about the flowers, about the rehearsal dinner menu. She called James's aunt, the kind one, the one who had warned me about strong opinions, and apparently suggested that perhaps the wedding could be simplified, given that one side of the family wasn't bringing a lot of tradition to the table. James's aunt told her that was a disgusting thing to say and reported the conversation to James directly. James confronted his mother. His mother cried and said she was only worried about him, and then called me the following week and left a voicemail saying she hoped there were no hard feelings and that she was adjusting. I saved the voicemail. I don't know why exactly. Evidence, maybe, of something. 2 weeks before the wedding, James's aunt called me. Aunt Beverly was a retired high school principal from Perth, Ontario, 72 years old, fond of strong opinions and stronger tea, and she was the person in that family who had treated me like a person from the very beginning. She had taken me to a farmer's market in my 3rd month of dating James and bought me a jar of local wildflower honey and told me James had been a disaster at relationships until me and that she could see why he'd finally gotten it right. "I need to warn you about something," she said on the phone. "My sister-in-law is planning to make a scene at the rehearsal dinner." I sat down. "What kind of scene?" "She's been talking to James's second cousin, not the nice one, the one in Canada who thinks everything is his business. She's apparently planning to stand up during toasts and raise some concerns about the marriage, publicly." I was quiet for a moment. Has she told James this? I doubt it. She knows he'd shut it down. I thanked Beverly and hung up, and then I sat at my kitchen table for 20 minutes thinking. James was at his clinic until 7. I had the afternoon. I called my maid of honor, my best friend since nursing school, a spectacularly pragmatic woman who had once talked to patient's family through a crisis while simultaneously coordinating a drone transfer and eating a granola bar. If anyone could help me think through a counter strategy in 2 hours, it was her. Okay, she said when I'd explained the situation. What do you want to happen? I want her to humiliate herself before she has the chance to humiliate me. She was quiet for a second. Then, I have some ideas. The rehearsal dinner was held at a private dining room at a restaurant in Westboro. The kind of place with a wood-burning fireplace and a prix-fixe menu and a wine list that went on for 4 pages. James had reserved it 2 months in advance. I arrived 45 minutes early. My maid of honor had a contact, a friend from her university days who now managed events at the restaurant. We had a brief, quiet conversation with the manager on duty, explained that we'd received information suggesting one of the guests might attempt to disrupt the event, and asked whether the staff could please let us know immediately if anyone began to circulate among the other guests before the dinner started or attempted to pass any written materials to the table. The manager, who had clearly dealt with worse, said that would be no problem at all. I then did something I'm still slightly proud of. James's mother didn't know me well enough to recognize me outside of context. We had met 3 times. She had never fully looked at me when we were in the same room. She had a habit of directing her attention just past me, the way you do with the television on in the background. She knew I was Asian, she knew I was a nurse, and she knew I was the woman who was marrying her son. Beyond that, I suspected her mental image of me was fairly vague. So I put my hair up, changed out of my nice dinner dress and into the spare outfit I'd brought. Plain black trousers, a white button-down, and when guests began arriving, I was standing near the entrance of the private dining room holding a clipboard. Not an official clipboard, just a clipboard. His mother arrived 20 minutes before the dinner was set to start. She was dressed beautifully, pearls, a deep navy dress, the whole presentation of a woman who intended to be taken seriously. She was with James's second cousin, the one from Kanata, and they were talking in a low, intent way that stopped when she saw me. She looked at me for a moment. Something flickered. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you with the venue?" "I'm helping coordinate this evening," I said, which was entirely true. "Good." She reached into her bag and produced a folded piece of paper. "I have some notes about the toasts, the order, and some additions I've arranged. I'll need you to pass this to whoever is emceeing." I took the paper. "Of course," I said. "I'll make sure it's seen." She nodded, satisfied, and moved into the room. I unfolded the paper. It was 4 paragraphs. The first expressed her joy at being there to celebrate her son. The second raised, delicately but unmistakably, her concerns about the cultural and familiar compatibility of the match. The third suggested, in language that was carefully constructed to seem like love and was actually something much colder, that James deserved a partner who understood the weight of the commitments his family has carried for generations in this community. The fourth wished us happiness in whatever form that takes. I read it twice, then I folded it back up and put it in my pocket. "Excuse me," said a voice beside me. I turned. It was Jean's second cousin, the one from Kanata. He was a broad man in his 50s with the particular energy of someone who believes he is more important than he is. "I wanted to check that my remarks are included as well," he said. "I sent an email to James last week." "I didn't receive that one," I said pleasantly. "Can you summarize for me?" He summarized. It was, in essence, a longer version of his mother-in-law's note, delivered with less polish and more apparent feeling. I nodded and said I would make sure his remarks were given appropriate consideration. Then I went to find Beverly. I found her near the fireplace, already holding a glass of red and wearing the expression of someone who had been waiting for this moment. I handed her the folded piece of paper. She read it. Her eyebrows rose steadily until they were somewhere near her hairline. "Well," she said, "I need a favor," I said. "I need you to be ready to stand up at the beginning of toasts and say something before anyone else can." Beverly looked at me with the expression of a woman who had spent 30 years managing teenagers and was not even slightly intimidated by this request. "What would you like me to say?" I told her. She smiled. "With pleasure." James arrived and the room filled up and dinner was served, and it was actually a beautiful evening. The food was excellent, the wine was good, the tables were covered in the ivory and sage greenery that we'd chosen together. His sister sat beside me and kept squeezing my arm. The Kanata cousin was 3 tables over and kept glancing at me in a way that I found privately hilarious, given that he still appeared to believe I was a member of the event staff. His mother was at the head table. She had been gracious all evening, composed and beautiful, the picture of a supportive family member. She hadn't looked at me directly once. James kept reaching for my hand under the table and squeezing it. He didn't know anything that was about to happen. I felt a brief, complicated pang of guilt about that. And then I looked at the piece of paper in my pocket, and the pang dissolved. When the plates were cleared and the MC, James's closest friend, a man named Gordon, who was a high school teacher in Kannada and deeply good at public speaking, stood to introduce the toasts, I caught Beverly's eye across the room. She was already standing. "I hope Gordon won't mind me going first," she said, loudly and cheerfully, in the voice of a woman who had commanded large rooms for decades. "I'm getting on in years and I tend to forget things if I wait too long." There was laughter. Gordon, who had been briefed by me that afternoon, stepped back with a small bow and said the floor was hers. Beverly set down her wine glass and looked around the room. "I've known James since the day he was born," she said. "I've watched him become an exceptional person, thoughtful, principled, the kind of man who earns people's trust quietly without announcing it." She paused. "And I've known, since about 3 months into his relationship with Maylin, that she was going to be good for him for the rest of his life. Not because she's easy or uncomplicated. Maylin is neither of those things, which is why she's right for him, but because she is honest, and she is brave, and she loves him in a way that has nothing to do with what he comes from or what his family owns." The room was very quiet. "I want to be direct," Beverly said, still in the same conversational, composed tone, "because I am 72 years old and I stopped not being direct around 1987. I know there are people at this table who have had reservations about this match. I would invite those people to examine where those reservations come from. And I would remind them," she picked up her glass, "that James is not a family asset. He is a person. And he chose someone extraordinary." She raised her glass. "To James and Maylin." The room raised their glasses. I heard his sister say yes under her breath beside me. I looked at his mother. She was holding her glass. Her face was very still. The Kannada cousin was staring at his own napkin. James's hand found mine under the table. He turned to look at me, and his expression, the way he looked at me in that exact moment, was something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. "Did you know she was going to do that?" he said quietly. "I may have had some idea," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. "Show me what's in your pocket." I hesitated. Then I handed him the folded piece of paper. He read it once. I watched his face change. He folded it back up, set it on the table between us, and put his hand flat over it. "Okay," he said, very quietly. "James, I'm not going to make a scene. I'm just going to handle it." He handled it. Not that night. He waited until the following morning, which I think took more discipline than I have. He drove to his mother's house and he sat down with her and he said the things that needed to be said. I wasn't there for that conversation. I didn't need to be. What I know is that he came home 3 hours later and he told me she would be at the wedding because she was his mother and he was not going to cut her out of his life. But she would not be speaking. Not a toast, not an intervention, not a quiet word to any guest. She had been told in terms that were apparently clear enough to reach her that the next incident, any incident, would have permanent consequences. His sister called me that afternoon. What he actually said, she told me, was that if she ever did anything like that again, She could choose between her grandchildren and her opinions because she would not be getting both. I held the phone for a moment after she said that. He really loves you, his sister said. Like, genuinely, he's not performing it. He means it. I know, I said, and I did. We got married on a Saturday in late May at the Heritage Barn outside of El Monte, with 200 guests and a string quartet and food that my mother and James's aunt had spent 2 weekends planning together. Butter chicken and ginger scallion noodles from my family's side, butter tarts and Montreal-style smoked meat from his. My mother cried during the ceremony. Beverly sat in the front row on James's side and winked at me when I walked past. His mother was there. She sat in her seat and she was composed, and she did not speak out of turn. During the reception, at one point, I walked past her table and she looked up at me. And for the first time in all the time I had known her, she held my gaze for a full moment. She didn't say anything. I didn't need her to. I had the rest of my life ahead of me. My husband was across the room, laughing at something Gordon had said, one hand in his pocket, already looking for me. I walked toward him. I still think about the moment she handed me her coat. Not the rehearsal dinner, not the speech, not even the wedding. That first evening at her house, me in the jade green blouse my mother had given me, holding a bottle of wine I'd researched for 2 weeks. And she looked right through me and handed me her coat like I was furniture. That was the moment I understood what I was dealing with. And honestly, in some strange way, I'm grateful I understood it early. Because the thing about being underestimated is that it only works against you if you don't know it's happening. What I've learned, and I mean really learned, not the version you say out loud at dinner parties, is that the people who try to diminish you are almost always telling you more about themselves than about you. James's mother didn't hand me that coat because I was beneath her. She handed it to me because she was frightened of what I represented, of what she couldn't control, of a future that wasn't arranged according to her specifications. Fear dressed up as contempt is still just fear. It took me a long time to see that clearly, but once I did, I couldn't unsee it. There's something I want to say about the clipboard too. I've had people ask me, when I've told the story to close friends, whether it was manipulative, setting things up the way I did, whether I should have just confronted her directly. And I understand the question, but I think there's a difference between manipulation and preparation. I didn't set a trap for her. I created a situation where she could reveal exactly who she already was on her own without any help from me. She wrote those 4 paragraphs herself. She handed them to me herself. All I did was make sure the right people were paying attention. That takes a certain kind of thinking, the kind that doesn't panic, doesn't react from pure emotion, but holds the larger picture steady, even when everything in you wants to just flip the table. I'm not naturally that person. I had to grow into it. Nursing helped, actually. You learn in trauma care that the moment you lose your composure is the moment your patient loses their best advocate. You stay clear so that they don't have to. And then there's Beverly, 72 years old, retired principal, standing up in a room full of people who half expected her to give a nice safe toast about how James used to love hockey and grew into a fine young man. Instead, she said the true thing. The hard thing. She didn't flinch. That kind of courage. The willingness to say what needs to be said even when the room is watching and the stakes are real. That's something I carry with me. It's a standard I hold myself to now. Not cruelty, not performance. Just honesty, offered with enough care that it lands. I walked down the aisle 3 weeks later. My mother was in the front row. Beverly was beside her. The barn smelled like cedar and those garden roses we'd argued about for weeks, and it was raining very lightly on the roof, and James was standing at the end of that aisle, looking at me like I was the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. His mother was there, seated, quiet, composed. She didn't get to speak, but she was there, and that was James's decision to make, not mine. He kept the door open, not because she'd earned it, but because he's that kind of person. the kind who holds on to the possibility that people can do better even when the evidence is thin. It's one of the reasons I love him. What happened to us? All of it, from that first quote to the folded piece of paper to Beverly's speech, followed a logic that had nothing to do with luck. The people who acted with integrity were the ones who could look back on that night without flinching. The ones who didn't had to live with what they'd shown the room. That's not a lesson I could have taught her. It's one she'll have to arrive at herself if she ever does. I just know which side of it I want to be on.